Hi, my name's JD Jordan, and I'm running for State Senate District 56.
Awesome. Well, welcome, JD, to
Thank you.
GCV and our podcast. So let's start off with something fun.
Okay.
What is one thing that you can absolutely not live without?
One thing that I absolutely can't live without? Well, I was born an only child, but I now have 5 children, and so I don't think I can live without that noise any longer of having 7 adult-sized humans in one home all the time. It's never boring. It's always a ton of fun, and it's for any parents out there. I mean, it's really rewarding to like raise your best friends and then to have like this awesome cohort to hang out with. I never want for a Fortnite squad.
Yeah. Oh my
Right.
gosh.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome. There's only 2, me and my brother, so that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
All the noise, you never think about
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So that's incredible. All right. So what areas does your district cover?
So State Senate District 56 is East Cobb, Roswell and Mountain Park in Fulton County, and Woodstock and Holly Springs in Cherokee County. So it's a 3-county area with about 189,000 people in it, and about half of those people are in unincorporated East Cobb.
And what are your 3 top legislative priorities if you are elected?
Well, I'm going to cheat and say 4,
That's
if
fine.
that's all right.
That's okay.
So the first 3 kind of fall under the broad umbrella of opposing government overreach into our personal lives, into our private lives, our families. And those are, as the parent of LGBTQ kids, to really work for LGBTQ equality across the board. But also the restoration and protection of reproductive freedoms for everyone, regardless of how they identify, and to put our public school system back in the hands of professional teachers and librarians, and to really oppose the divisive topics laws and the book challenge, or I think the anti-democratic book challenge system that we currently have in place. And then the other one is to really strive for improving the constituent experience. My background is in user experience design and customer experience design, and I think there is a tremendous gap between the sort of experience we have with a company that we subscribe to, as opposed to a government that we're paying taxes to. And part of what motivated my wife and I to throw in on the race in the first place was our incumbent legislator refused to talk to us about the anti-trans healthcare bill, SB 140, that was directly affecting our kids. And this was a guy that I used to work with, so I had his direct cell phone number, we had his office number, we hammered him on social media, never a word.
Right.
So, and I think that we all deserve better than that, regardless of ideological persuasion, right? If I'm a Democrat and he's a Republican, he's still my rep, and it's still his job to listen to me and understand my point of view to the best of his ability.
Absolutely. I love that. And so in that, what is your stance on economic development and job creation in the state, but also in your district? So how it relates to the state of Georgia, but how it relates to how it's going to affect your future constituents?
Sure. I will just say from a context perspective, the State Senate District 56, again, that's East Cobb, Roswell, Woodstock, is predominantly a college-educated demographic. It's predominantly people who work in the professional services. A lot of them are working from home. A lot of them commute into the city. So, and that's a lot of what I do too. That's a lot of my career also. I feel like I know that demo very well. But one of the things my opponent in particular, and I think incumbents in this state like to talk about, is how we're the #1 state for business in the country, which is really not true, right? So there's one trade publication that says that, and great, I would love that talking point also. But when you do sort of a meta-analysis of what the economic literature says, Georgia does well, but we're not the top. And I don't think you can really fairly say we're the top state for business if we're not also the top state for the people that work in those businesses. And so one of the ways I like to tie that back to my priorities is to just sort of like vocally ask the question, if you were trying to get a member of the LGBT community to relocate to Georgia for the job, why would they do that when their access to healthcare might be limited because of their gender identity and they would lack particular job protections because of their orientation? If you were trying to recruit a woman who's not ready to have a family yet to relocate to Georgia, why would she do that when she doesn't have a guarantee of bodily autonomy and she doesn't have access to what could potentially be life-saving healthcare for herself? Never mind her unborn. And I think generally for parents, why would a family relocate to Georgia where the public school system's being compromised
Attacked.
at every level of government, being underfunded by the state, not just the voucher program, but in general, right? And that affects both the quality of the person I'm raising and launching as an adult, but also more mundane things like my home value, right? So I think there are lots of questions you can ask about why Georgia isn't the best state to be an employee
Right.
that really undermine the question about the best state for business. And so that's where my focus would be.
Awesome. So going more into environment and infrastructure, which is a huge conversation in the state of Georgia, really around America, but especially in the state of Georgia. What are your plans for addressing environmental concerns and promoting sustainability in the state of Georgia?
Okay, so this is a huge question.
Yeah, it's very huge.
And I suspect we'll touch on lots of different parts of
points,
it. But for context, I'll point out that State Senate District 56 is bordered on the south by the Chattahoochee River.
Yeah.
And so two of the most salient points that then just rise from that piece of context is water scarcity issues and water quality issues.
Yeah.
The scarcity issues, and not even in a drought period, are still very large, right? We've had disputes with surrounding states, Tennessee, Alabama, and Florida. We've litigated with all of them over access to fresh water supplies. And then I believe, and I apologize, I can't remember if it was AJC or WADE, but one of them had an article just this week about how incredibly polluted some of the suburban water sources are with the forever chemicals that we're all walking around in, right? Like my grandfather had lead in his system, my dad has asbestos in his system, and I have microplastics in my system, right? So these are all issues that affect everybody, but these are all very salient to my district as well. So I think a lot of what we can do is try to negotiate in better faith with the other states that have these that we're in conflict with. If it gets to litigation, that's incredibly costly. So there needs to be better priority on making it work from the outset, and then making sure that our water infrastructure, whether that's the plumbing, which I'm sure we'll talk more about as well, is up to snuff and up to an efficiency standard that handles the matter, and then also that we are enforcing existing environmental protection legislation.
Right.
Again, it's all about sustaining a limited water supply that needs to be clean for the benefit of everybody.
Right. How do you propose to improve Georgia's infrastructure, including transportation and public utilities?
Okay, another huge one.
Yeah, very huge question.
Right. And so, again, from a context perspective, if you look at my district, we've got some places like Roswell, which is an antebellum city that predates Atlanta. And then some other ones like Woodstock, that's a Reconstruction era city, right? So we have relatively old municipalities. And if Atlanta is any indication, it's reasonable to suspect that the plumbing under these cities may be legacy as well.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly the bridges above ground suggest that they are, right? Because we have not been maintaining that infrastructure. We probably haven't been maintaining our underground infrastructure either.
At all.
And what's challenging about infrastructure is that it's expensive and it's not sexy, right? So when you build it, that's great. There's huge influx of money and jobs. When you maintain it, that's tedious and it causes traffic.
Right.
And then
we already have.
Oh, sure. Right. Yes, absolutely. And then, of course, we have, you were talking about other infrastructure issues. I actually do this thing when I go out to public events, and I do it on my website, forthe56.com, also where I ask people, like, what's important to you?
Yeah.
And then my day job is as a digital product designer. And so one of the things that I do with that data is I try to find the trends in it. And this is based on a concept really well illustrated by a Henry Ford quote, where he said, if you ask people what they want, they'd say they want a faster horse, right? Because they can't imagine a car. Right, that's not their job to. They're just saying what their pain point is. And so when I'm at these events, and I'm affinity mapping, that's the term where you organize these thoughts to find trends, one of the things that keeps coming up is people want accessible communities that they can afford to live in, but where also they can walk, they can ride bikes, they can use non-car transportation.
Right.
So from an infrastructure perspective, it's a little bit of a reimagining of what our small towns and suburbs look like. But I think a really specific salient point someone mentioned to me just last night at a live in Roswell was if you're a nurse and you work in East Cobb and you don't have a car, how do you get there? There's no mass transit option for the East Cobb community.
Yeah.
So that's certainly one as well. And then there's power diversification.
Yeah.
As much as I don't want my power bill to go up the way it's about to go up, and as much as I don't want to brag about the plant Vogel process. It's exciting that we have those nuclear reactors as a green tech, if you take that point of view, which I'm taking that point of view.
Yeah.
And that we have this really diverse power grid. But you also hear Georgia Power say that, oh, well, we may have to abandon some of our sustainability goals in order to meet short-term demand. And that's very concerning.
Scary.
Right. So, because right now, and I believe I have this right in the order of priority, our power comes from natural gas, nuclear, non-hydro renewables like solar, coal,
Yep.
and and then hydro. Right. So there's already a good mix, and that's great. And that mix needs to be encouraged. So from a legislative perspective, I think there's a lot we can do to encourage local communities to have better sustainability programs. This is everything from encouraging like porous parking surfaces and green roofs, because those will limit runoff, which again comes back to water scarcity and cleanliness issues. You can introduce things like non-mowing wilded highway medians in public spaces, which is good for biodiversity.
Right.
And then further encouraging investments in energy infrastructure that is sustainable, right? So we've got a lot of people who want solar. For instance, we manufacture panels here in the state. We should be encouraging people, probably with some kind of incentive, especially if it's using a panel that's made here in the state, to expand that solar network as well.
Right, absolutely. Georgia DCV, we just we're doing a program with Georgia Bright. And so it's a program that offers solar to people who have income under $100,000.
Yeah.
And so it's like they lease it out, and it's a good program. So you guys should check that out.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, because before the interview started, I had mentioned the example of Mimosa Hall, which is a historic building in downtown Roswell. It's one of the handful of historic homes that predate the war.
Right.
And but they recently took one of the old Jimmy Carter panels from the White House that Reagan took off the White House, and they put it on the roof. And this uninsulated old little house has a power bill of like $2 to $3 a month.
Crazy.
Now. And it's pretty fascinating what you can do. There's actually a lot more that you can do than just save money on your bill, and the law doesn't really support it yet, but I'm sure we'll get to that.
Yeah, so how do you plan, so with everything that we've talked about in infrastructure and sustainability, how do you plan to support Georgia's agriculture industry while also addressing environmental concerns?
That's a great one. I think regardless of your position on climate change, we can all agree that the climate has been doing some damage to our agriculture lately. We've got irregular temperatures have caused failures in the blueberry and peach crops. Hurricanes have caused failures in the pecan crop, and then over-farming has done damage to the soil.
Right.
I think this is kind of an exciting place, though, because the vast majority of Americans, whether they're rural or urban in origin or suburban in origin, given my district, are kind of equally supportive of climate initiatives, especially clean water, clean air, renewable energy, energy efficiency. But the partisan language around the environment creates a barrier. So I think a solution-oriented perspective rather than a ideology-oriented perspective can align us on this. And one of the ones that I think is a really exciting opportunity is I would love to see the state incentivize dual land use options for agriculture, where we can say, an example would be to put solar panels on a field that's also used by livestock, right? So it affords shade for the livestock, it affords water reclamation for the land because it's shaded. It also gives the farmer energy independence and potentially a second revenue stream, assuming we can
put it back in the grid.
Put it back in the grid.
Yeah.
Another option is land restoration practices, sustainable farming practices. The ROI on that is not as clear. It's a complicated issue about how we, revive the soil.
Land.
If any of the audience watch Clarkson's Farm on Amazon, their Series 3 specifically addresses this issue. They're trying to recharge the soil, and they confront sort of the traditional farmer's point of view about, is this going to work? This can't possibly work, as well as the longitudinal environmental view is, if it doesn't work, we're going to burn out the farm in 10, 20 years, right? You can't just keep dumping nitrogen into the soil and expect to get quality produce out of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had worked with some farmers a couple of years ago, and so talking about how the weather has really changed the seasons of the crop as well. So you would get watermelon in like June. Now you get it
Yeah.
in April or February, and so it changes the time that they're having to put in when crops are popping up at times that they're not supposed to, or water rot.
Sure.
So those are a couple of things that farmers have really been dealing with. So we've done a lot of work.
Of
in
course.
that
And then
area.
and some of the stuff we've already talked about,
Yeah.
right? Like water scarcity and the
Yeah.
cleanliness of that water affects the yield on those farms.
Right.
Yeah.
So what is your stance on renewable energy? I kind of already know it. And what steps will you take to promote its use in Georgia and then in your district as well?
Yeah. So I hope it's clear.
Yeah.
I'm big in renewable energy, but I'm big in it not just ideologically because it's
Right.
I want a great Earth for my kids, right, and for their kids and
your kids'
ongoing.
kids, yeah.
I was that little middle school kid in the '90s, like crushing cans in the pantry, like trying to save the Earth
Save the
or
Earth.
whatever. But I think there's a lot we can do that takes advantage of the fact that there is a very strong return on investment precedent for renewable technology, especially when compared to fossil fuels, both in terms of the jobs that can be created by putting them in place in the first place, but also the cleanliness factor, the fact that they don't pollute. There's a really strong ROI argument for it. So I would love to see an expansion of solar in the state. We're the largest state east of the Mississippi, and the only state east of the Mississippi that gets more sun than us is Florida. We do really well from a sun
Yeah.
perspective. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be putting solar panels
Everywhere.
on all these suburban homes, southern-facing suburban homes, right,
Yes.
like mine. And I think there's other things we can do too. I think though we have a very small coastal footprint, there's a very strong wind scenario that is consistent off our southern coast.
Yeah.
Offshore wind farms have proven to be successful in other
Yeah.
markets. There's also biomass fuel, which I think is something our agricultural sector could take advantage of. We have enormous agriculture, an enormous agricultural market. We have a lot of forest, so there's lots of opportunity to take advantage of that. And regardless of debating about how we got nuclear reactors
Right.
online, we are the first state in 30 years to bring new reactors online, and I would love to see continued exploration of next generation nuclear power. Bill Gates has a project right now in Wyoming to demo next generation power. France and Japan, who never really stopped developing this technology like we and other countries did, have demonstrated that it can work on a variety of scales. So I'm really excited to see those continue to grow. So I would love to see the state legislature back developments in all those areas, and specifically to incentivize businesses and residents to do the installation, or because that is where there can be a significant cost. Like, it's nice to say, oh, your power bill could be just a couple bucks a month, but if it's going to cost you thousands and thousands of dollars to get there, that's an impediment, right? To adoption, even by the people in the 56 who are predominantly a middle-class demographic, right? And then I'd also like to see, and I apologize for not knowing the term off the top of my head, but the scheme that would allow homeowners and businesses who put renewable energy, windmills and solar panels on their properties, to be able to sell that power back into the grid.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I think Texas is a great example of what happens when you have a mostly monolithic and isolated power grid,
Right.
what can happen to that grid and what can happen to the people living on that grid, as opposed to a more diverse grid that is more reliable, it's more flexible, and it's more sustainable. And we need to look beyond just building big reactors, but taking advantage of the real estate the citizens and residents of the state are already using.
Yeah. So we used to have a program such as that where people would have their solar go back into the grid and they would get paid for it from Georgia Power. Unfortunately, it was capped at a certain number of people that could do it. So what GCV has been trying to do for the last couple of years is, and along with all of our other sustainability partners and orgs across Georgia, is get that law to not have some type of cap, but try to get that program expanded. So we've been working on that project for probably the last 3 years. I've been trying to just expand that program so it's not a cap, and when you do get solar, you can sell it back into the grid, because your power is going back into the grid anyway, regardless, when you have those. And so if Georgia Power is paying you for the power that you're supplying the grid, it is another incentive for you to have that solar in your house, and it's a good bump for you because you made this investment, so it should benefit you in more ways than one.
Yeah, we definitely need it, because if you look at some of the emerging industries coming into Georgia and emerging nationwide, like data centers use a fabulous amount of power, right? And then the AI based data centers, the ones that run them, use an enormous amount of water as well as an enormous amount of power, right? So if we want to remain a leader in bringing new technology companies into the state, we need to grow that grid. And why wouldn't you democratize the growth of that grid in a way that benefits the consumer as well as the business?
How do you plan to address income equality and support low-income families in Georgia within your district? I know you have a certain level of demographic in your district, but outside of that, as you're making laws in the legislature, how are you going to address the income equality for them?
Okay, so there are a couple context pieces there, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
just because the median
Right.
of the 56 state Senate district tends to be middle class professional does not mean there's not poverty in the district.
Absolutely.
And there's poverty in the state, right? So any state senator, whether they represent Savannah or East Cobb, is going to have statewide influence, right? So, and I believe there was an article that came out just this week about how Atlanta has the greatest income inequality of any major city in the United States.
Yep.
There are a lot of ways
Nuances.
to address this.
Yeah.
I tend to think of it from the point of view of Maslow's hierarchy of need, right? Sort of what is the base of the pyramid that people build upon?
Right.
And so if poverty is going to be the root of so many of the ills in society, never mind for yourself, I think we need to tackle things like expanding Medicaid, right? You can't work if you're not healthy, and you can't work well if you can't get positive health outcomes over the long term. Forbes rated us as the worst state in the country for healthcare access, and that's not even including mental health care access, right? So if we want to grow the economy, we want to give people a way to rise out of poverty, they have to be healthy, right? And that healthcare has to be expansive. And I will, because there is an ideological divide on Medicaid expansion, I always like to remind people that there are 40 other states that have expanded Medicaid, which is predominantly funded by the federal government, 90%, that have a demonstrated return on investment for doing this. I think the next thing you do is you expand universal pre-K. Thankfully, the ballot initiative or the amendment we're going to vote on in November for sports betting, which some people like sports betting, that's fine. I don't have a strong opinion on sports betting, to be perfectly honest, but I do like that it would put money into the Hope Scholarship Program and it would put money into the pre-K program, because there have been a lot of studies. There was a federal study recently that showed that for every $1 put into pre-K, you get $4 out of the economy, because all of a sudden the kids are fed and the moms can work. Right. So Medicaid and pre-K enormously open up the labor market and people's ability to move through it and then improve themselves. So those are absolutely two. And I would take the pre-K one slightly farther and say we should feed kids at school.
Absolutely.
Right. Because so much of the poverty that people experience is easily avoidable and not particularly expensive, especially in a state that has such a valuable economy as we have in the metro Atlanta area, where the counties are just booming all the time.
Right.
So those would sort of be the main things I would do. I think there's a lot of other issues you could tackle. I think we've got to absolutely have a public transit solution that could be done. I'm not a fan. I would love to see more non-car solutions to transport, because again, there's lots of precedent that shows if you widen the roads, you just put more cars on them, you don't necessarily improve traffic.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be heavy rail. There's all sorts of solutions all over the world that we can look at for examples of how to do mass transit in a way that can give people more access to jobs. And I think one of the things that our legislature can specifically do, given who they employ, is we can look at people who are in law enforcement and public education in particular and provide a stipend that allows them to live in the communities they serve.
That they work.
Right. So because back to that, what I was saying earlier, if you're a public school teacher in East Cobb but you don't have a car, how do you get to the school? Well, if you live nearby, then that problem is moot.
Maybe you can walk or carpool or do things that make sense. And I also think working in the community that you live in, especially as working in public service, also just helps you see the people differently. So talking about, our law enforcement being able to live in the communities that they serve in, it's important to see the everyday human experiences of the people that they're serving. So even into that, let's talk about how you plan to address racial and social justice issues in our state, which sometimes go hand in hand with how people feel towards our law enforcement and how we interact with them and how we all live peaceably together and are able to support them, but also feel safe in our communities. How will you address those issues across the board for the state of Georgia?
And I really appreciate this question, because my opponent is the chair of the Public Safety Committee in the Senate. So when we look at questions like why hasn't Georgia enacted any sort of gun safety laws in the last 12, 14 years?
Yeah.
I can point to someone in particular if you would like, right? There are other ones include, or one of the ones that frustrates me the most is Georgia has the most people who are under criminal supervision of any democracy on earth. So there are over 500,000 Georgians who are either imprisoned or on parole or some form of probation. It's an enormous population of people.
Right.
And so I think if we want to talk about how do we improve the criminal justice system, one of the things I think we need to do is maybe pivot the focus from being hard on crime to being smart on it. Because, and one of the ways I would specifically address that is I am very passionate about taking away pre-trial penalty, right? So you should be able to continue to work and your family should not fall apart just because you've been charged with something. Right. And so that takes the form of doing away with cash bail so that folks aren't rotting in prison just because, rotting in jail because they can't afford to post out.
Yeah.
Especially for, and this is for nonviolent offenses. I'm not talking about
the big stuff.
Right, the big stuff. But I think we can use citations in lieu of arrest.
Yeah.
And it was funny, my wife and I did the Citizen Police Academy in Roswell about this time last year.
Yeah.
And one of the things on my ride along with the cops that they were talking about is how much they hate taking people down to Rice Street because they're like, some of these people aren't going to come out of that building for a very long time. And they're not going to be better off than they were when they went in there. And they haven't been convicted of anything yet.
Right.
I think another thing we can do is just be aware of the national trend, regardless of, again, where you might be on the use of marijuana. Decriminalization is coming.
Yeah.
It already has come for a lot of medical uses.
Yep.
I was actually a very early recipient of a Georgia medical marijuana card when I had cancer a few years ago.
Yeah.
And there were only a few conditions that it was allowed for, but the doctors at Emory were very direct about that there was a positive medical outcome for being a part of this program.
Right.
We've now seen it in a lot of other states. There's a huge revenue opportunity for the state and local governments as well. So I think we need to reform our marijuana laws and expunge the records of people who are in prison for low-level offenses.
Yeah.
And because the goal, I think, isn't just, it's about keeping families together. It's about letting people continue to work before they've been convicted, making sure that the punishments meet the crime and that it actually is a crime. Right. Yeah.
So on that, I know you mentioned you were a cancer survivor. So just touching on that, congratulations. I'm glad you're still here with us.
Oh yeah, 7 years clean. So
absolutely.
Thank you.
So
as
a cancer survivor, what is one thing that you want people to take away from you when they meet you? What's one thing you want people to know? Because I know it's something I've lost family members from cancer, and so I know it's something very hard that a lot of people go through and suffer through. What's one thing that now that you're on the other side of it that you want people to remember just about life in general as a cancer survivor?
So I getting a cancer diagnosis, as I'm sure with any serious terminal diagnosis, is a dump truck just driving through your life. And it was, I suppose I like to tell people I had the benefit of chemo brain while I was going through it because my wife remembers every horrible moment of my treatment, whereas I was cloudy for a fair amount of it. But like any crisis, I found that I would have done anything to survive, right? And so if you told me I had to learn line dancing and that would improve my odds of surviving cancer, I would 100% have learned line dancing. That's a funny example, right? But, if they tell me I need to change my diets and I need to, take medical marijuana and I need to do this instead and get this sort of screening, I'll do anything as long as I don't die. And one of that all is incumbent upon having access to healthcare and good healthcare outcomes. I'm very fortunate that I had a middle-class job, that I lived where I lived and was very close to the Emory Johns Creek Hospital where they had absolutely the most spectacular colorectal cancer surgeon and team to help me through it. And the Emory team at St. Joe's also, who had a fantastic oncology team. So I had an enormous amount of support. I also had great family support. Not everyone gets these things. The one place where we had a significant problem when I was going through cancer treatment was that my wife and I had a small business at the time. We were a 2-person company. and we were married. So from the insurance company's perspective, we were a single entity.
Yeah.
We had a handful of contractors, but no full-time employees. So we get to the end of, I believe it was fiscal year 2017.
Right.
I'm halfway through chemo, and Blue Cross Blue Shield dropped us because they didn't want to sell direct to consumer anymore. We had no option.
Yeah.
We made enough money at the time that we didn't really qualify for a marketplace benefit, right? But there was no other public access, and there were no private options to us that was particularly affordable. We actually ended up having to hire somebody at our own expense so that we could afford very expensive private insurance.
Yeah.
And we're also parents. We have 5 kids. So all of our insurance engagements are very expensive.
Yeah.
And this actually leads, I know this isn't a unique cancer problem, but it leads to a problem I see. I know the majority of people are not small business people.
Right.
I appreciate that. But I do believe that the access to healthcare in our state, really in our country, is almost feudal, like medieval feudal in origin. If you don't work for a large enterprise or for the government, your access to really quality, affordable healthcare is extremely limited. As it is right now, my wife and I are still small business people.
Yeah.
She's a creative recruiter. I'm a digital product designer. Our insurance is incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
It provides very low net benefit. And it is extremely hard to sustain. So regarding the cancer, I have to get a colonoscopy once a year. I have not been able to do that yet this year because my insurance company, which is required
Not covering it.
to support me getting preventative colonoscopy, because of my background, it hasn't been long enough in the year yet.
Wow.
And so there are a lot of boundaries that even someone with good means, like I check a lot of demographic boxes.
Yeah.
And I should not have trouble getting a preventative healthcare assessment that will keep me alive, right? And this only gets worse as you go down income brackets. And again, this comes back to what I was saying before, like healthcare is the base of the economy. You can't work if you're not healthy. You can't raise your family if you're not healthy. You can't go to school if you're not healthy. And in the 18th century, they didn't have a robust healthcare system, right? But the first promise of the Constitution is life, right? And most of our Constitution the federal Constitution, and our state too, spends most of its time talking about the liberty promise, right? How we're going to manage contracts, how we're not going to arrest you for no reason, all that stuff, right? But we're the most powerful, most developed country on earth, and a lot of us can't get our teeth cleaned, much less survive cancer, right? And it's dispiriting, and it's not just, and it's so easy to fix, especially when we're just leaving money on the table by not expanding Medicaid here in the state.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being transparent and open about your experience. So into that.
No, the Cancer Club is the suckiest club, right? And a lot of people don't want to talk about it, but I think it's important because it is a trauma, and it's a trauma that a significant number of the population have.
Go through. Yeah. Okay, so how will you engage with and be accessible to your constituents if you're successful for the 56?
Okay. I could talk about this all day. So again, as I was saying, my background is in user experience design, customer experience design. If you look at most large enterprise companies, even the ones that don't have great track records for customer service, like some of our telecom providers in particular, most of them, though, have a 24-hour response time. If you reach out for help, they will get back to you within 24 hours. There will be some serious trouble on their back end for those employees if they don't get back to customers within 24 hours. That said, IndyGov, which is a company that I am in no way affiliated with, who just did a study on what are the constituent experience response rates for elected officials across several states, found that only 8% of constituent messages get responded to within 90 days. It's a higher response rate the more local the office, but that's still shockingly low. It's totally unacceptable, right? I think we should be holding our elected officials to the same standard, or at least a very close standard to what we expect from business.
Right.
They are doing a professional service job for us, right? They are representing us in their legislature, in their executive, in their branch of government, whatever the case may be. And they can't do it if they're not talking to people.
To the constituents.
So some of that is good old-fashioned stuff like town halls and outreach.
Yeah.
I think especially given young Gen X, Millennial, and Z habits, that has to be done online as well as in person.
Yep.
But I think it's also, there are constituent experience platforms specifically. And even if there weren't, there are customer experience platforms that can be weaponized
Utilized,
for
right.
government so that legislators and executives can reach out to people proactively and be more transparent. So this is something I care a lot about. As I said earlier, I think one of the things that got my wife and I to decide to run was how unresponsive our legislator was to us. And so I am very interested, and hopefully you'll see this if you go to my website. I'm very passionate about being proactive and transparent about communication. What is the legislature doing? What am I, in this case as the candidate, but hopefully as a legislator, doing, and how does that affect you?
Right.
Can you reach me so that I know your opinion? I might disagree with you, but it's still my job to know the opinion. Also to combat ethics issues, to be proactive about it.
Yeah.
If we're going to debate certificate of need modifications, who in the state legislature has skin in that game, right? If we're going to say that gas stations shouldn't be required to put cameras, on their exterior for security purposes, well, maybe who in the Senate owns some gas stations, right?
Yeah.
These are worthwhile questions to know, above and beyond the more obvious stuff like stocks.
Right.
Because the vast majority of Americans don't own stock. The vast majority of Americans don't own businesses.
Right.
But some of these guys do.
Yeah.
And I say guy in a non-gendered way, right?
Yeah,
like some of these
absolutely.
people do, right? And then the last one is a proactive constituent experience platform.
Yeah.
It should be easy to reach your rep. It should be easy to get information about them and what they're doing.
Yeah.
And even if they can't get back to you within 24 hours, right?
Some type of response.
They should get back to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, where can the people find you? You don't have to look at the computer.
Of course.
Where can they find you?
So the hub of everything is my website, forthe56.com.
Okay.
I buck the trend a little bit and don't have a campaign website that has my name on it because this isn't about me. It's about the people who live in East Cobb, Roswell, and Woodstock. Hopefully, they'll agree and they'll choose me when November comes around. But I'm also on basically every social media platform, Facebook, Insta, X, TikTok. I'm even on Nextdoor because I want to be reachable.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and it's certainly been a pleasure to have you in our chair.
Thank you very much. This has been a ton of fun. I really appreciate it.
Awesome.